Turning now overseas, the White House is strongly denying it had anything to do with two drones that exploded over the Kremlin yesterday morning in what Russia claims was an assassination attempt on Vladimir Putin.
The United States was not involved in this incident in any way, contrary to Mr. Peskov's lies. And that's what they are, just lies.
Putin was not at the Kremlin at the time of the alleged drone attack, and the two explosions did little damage to the Russian equivalent of the White House. Ukraine's president yesterday immediately denied that his forces had anything to do with the brazen attack. And now there are questions about whether Putin is using a false flag operation to escalate tensions with the West. And it all comes as the director of national intelligence said today that Russia is facing a shortage of troops and ammunition in Ukraine and is unlikely to launch a major offensive this year. Joining us now with perspective on all of this and more is the former Defense Secretary under President Trump, Mark Esper. Secretary Esper, good to have you here.
Good evening, Elizabeth.
Russia has provided zero evidence that the United States, or Ukraine for that matter, are behind these attacks. Is this looking more like a false flag operation to you or the work of some rogue saboteurs?
Well, I think it's possible that it's any of the above. I think it's possible that it could be a false flag, but I'm actually more inclined to think that it is either a pro-Ukrainian group in Russia that launched these attacks, or it is a anti-Putin group in Russia that did so. Given the nature of it, the proximity, and the fact that, in my perspective, it wasn't intended to assassinate or do massive damage, but intended to embarrass the Kremlin. And that's kind of where I draw my conclusions from.
Yeah, Ukraine has managed to pull off audacious attacks against Russia in the past. We had the sinking of the Russian flagship, the bombing of the bridge to Crimea. Both those times, Ukraine did not deny responsibility and, in fact, even gloated off the record about it. The drone attack is different. They immediately said, not us.
Yeah, that's right. It is different. And look, in this case, too, for a drone to be launched from Ukraine, it would have to traverse hundreds of miles to get to Moscow and then make its way through Russian air defense systems. My suspicion is this was locally launched and delivered, and again, intended to embarrass the Kremlin. Now, what the Kremlin is doing in return is trying to use it as a means to rally the Russian people, because they know that an offensive is coming. They know that they've lost tens of thousands of troops in Russia, and the Russian people aren't fully behind them. And then on top of this now, trying to blame Washington, D.C., is another means by which they try to convince the Russian people that they aren't losing to Ukraine, they are losing to the United States and NATO. And this is part of their strategic disinformation and messaging that they're trying to do.
So why don't you think it was a false flag attack? Russia has used that ploy before.
They have. In this case, I don't know why one would attack their own capital and demonstrate the vulnerability of their capital, their lack of air defense, so forth and so on, to accomplish such a thing. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I just think it's less likely than a couple other things.
We do know that, like just a couple of months ago, Russia increased the air defenses in the capital. This doesn't say a lot about that air defense increase.
Yeah, I mean, it sat right on top of what's called the Senate Palace, where Putin occasionally resides. So that's why, in my view, it wasn't an assassination attempt. It wasn't. They weren't trying to cause massive destruction. The intent was to embarrass and score political points against the Kremlin.
In the meantime, former Russian President Medvedev is saying today that the attack justifies, quote, the physical elimination of Zelensky. Putin's spokesman is warning of, quote, severe and inevitable punishment against Ukraine. All this for two drones exploding that caused no damage and hurt nobody. What's the play here? Like, the rhetoric seems way outsized for what actually happened.
It's even worse than that, Elizabeth. Look, they've been trying to kill Zelensky since before the war. And right after the war began, they sent in commando squads to take him out. And the question is, what haven't they done to Ukraine? They're bombing the Ukrainian people with missiles and rockets and drones. They're raping and killing and murdering on the battlefield and in towns across Ukraine. There's really not much left to do when it comes into the category of war crimes. So look, I think they are girding the Russian people for this offensive that they know is coming, that they probably suspect they won't be able to beat back. And we'll see how well the Ukrainians do when it actually finally kicks off.
There have been calls from Russian hawks that they need to draft, that they have to, Putin needs to issue a draft, and get more Russian bodies, to be honest, out in the field. They're losing, 20,000 dead, 80,000 injured just in the past 5 months. Do you think that they're using this drone attack, whoever's responsible for it, to maybe really rally the Russians to support a draft like that?
Yeah, I think so. As we know, last fall they had a draft. They brought in 300,000 young men or so, and many Russians also left the country, went into exile. And then since then, the DoD reports that well over 200,000 Russians have been killed or injured in the conflict. 90% of Russia's land army has been committed. Not only do they not have the material and the ammunition to really prosecute their own type of offensive, they are running out of men. And at some point, they're going to have to turn to an additional draft. Now, they do a draft twice a year, but I'm talking about an additional conscription on top of that in order to replace their losses.
Yeah, that might not go over so well with the Russian public. They might finally wake up to, wait a second, right, not my son, not my husband. All right, Secretary Esper, so great to have you on the show again.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.